Good evening, welcome to New Horizons. If you have a mobile phone, if you'd like to put it on silent, please, thank you. Right, massive welcome to Terry Boardman, with Britain's responsibility in 1914 and its relation to our current world situation. Author Terry, you've got a recent book now available, Mapping the Millennium, Behind the Plans of the New World Order. Tonight, historian and meticulous researcher Terry takes us back 100 years to World War I, sometimes called the Great War in so much as it was big. Horrendous loss of life as soldiers signed up to fight, only just into their teen years, just boys. Terry points to the causative factors of this conflict being contrary to what officially currently carries the name of truth, and the intimate link between the instigators of the war and the New World Order, thought by some to be modern in origin. Terry also underscores the importance of mankind's need to know the truth about this war when we realise what may be at stake today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Terry Boardman.
Thank you very much. It's very good to be here. Can you hear me all right at the back?
Yes.
Yeah? Good. Okay. So, Britain's responsibility in 1914 and its relation to today. I first got interested in this subject when I was 12 years old. At that time, the BBC did a series on TV, some of you may remember it, in the early 60s. It went on for about 24 episodes, called The Great War. And it's quite a remarkable thing. You can still see it on YouTube. And it's remarkable because, well, it was for me remarkable at that time, because as somebody brought up in the 50s as a child and seeing lots of war movies on TV, that was all about the Second World War. But we saw nothing in those days about the First World War. And like I'm sure many of you, I had grandparents involved in the First World War. And I was very close to my grandmother, and she was actually one of the first women soldiers even. And she also told me about the experiences of her relatives, some of whom were killed, some of whom were badly injured. And so I heard a lot about it from her. But when this series, The Great War, was produced on BBC in 1964, then suddenly one saw all this amazing footage, and it was suddenly as if the world of my grandparents was visible for the first time. Not only tiny little clips, but long extended ones. And that was really eye-opening. And so that really started me studying it. And very quickly I got interested in the event which sort of really starts the whole thing off. In 1914, 28th of June, Sarajevo, today Bosnia. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie. She often gets left out, and she shouldn't, because there's a very interesting story behind this couple, which I can't go into all of it today, except to say that it was a love story between two people from different nationalities. She was a Slav, he was an Austrian, member of the Habsburg dynasty, and he married beneath him, so to speak. And he married for love, not for dynasty. And he encountered terrific resistance to his marriage. And they were basically shunned by the rest of Viennese high society and, of course, by the imperial family. But he was the heir apparent. He was the crown prince. And the emperor was in his 80s and soon to die, so at any time Franz Ferdinand could have become the emperor. And in 1900, he chose to marry this Czech lady from a noble family which wasn't high enough to marry into the imperial family. That's why they were shunned. It was a morganatic marriage. He had to give up all the rights for his children to inherit and so on in order to marry this woman. And it was interesting, you see, because after all, the Germans, the Austrians, they were on the top in the empire. The other people who were on the top in the empire were the Hungarians. That's why it was called the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And they rather sat on top of all the other nationalities, particularly the Slavs, and the Czechs, of course, Slavs. Now, the empire was somewhat ramshackle, and Franz Ferdinand felt that the way to save the empire in the 20th century was to change it from being a dual monarchy, a system where two nationalities were on the top, so to speak, to one where three were, a trial or a triadic monarchy or empire. So the Slavs would have equal rights with the Austrians and the Hungarians. Now, this is where the first important point comes, you see, because one often hears, well, if they hadn't killed this man, then they would have killed somebody else and the war would have started that way. But no, the assassins chose their man very carefully. And it was very significant that this man and his wife, the symbol, if you like, of this relationship between the German and the Slav, that these people should be killed. And particularly because, as I say, Franz Ferdinand wanted to make peace in the empire. He didn't want war with anybody. He didn't want war with any Slavic people. He didn't want war with Russia, with any of the Slavic countries, and particularly not with their troublesome neighbour Serbia, also a South Slavic country. And that meant that Franz Ferdinand, this is the family, and this is the assassin, Gavrilo Princip. I'll just mention, it's often interesting, he was only 19 at the time, a Bosnian ultra-nationalist student, and he basically believed in a South Slavic state, independence, but he wanted Bosnia to come out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and join with the other South Slavic countries, what later would become Yugoslavia, only not under the control of Serbia. He didn't want the Serbs to control this new South Slav state. But he was prepared to kill for that. And so he did. I won't go into the circumstances of the assassination. That's a fascinating story in itself, how it happened and how it almost didn't happen. But this is the couple, and this are their children. His name, Gavrilo Princip, it's often interesting to notice the names of people in history, because his name, Gavrilo Princip, means Gabriel Prince, or Prince Gabriel. He's named after an archangel, but an archangel of the moon, and an archangel who has a specific role, as it were, in traditional culture, which has very much to do with the earth and with nationality, you might say. And Gavrilo Princip, the Gabriel principle, Prince Gabriel, he was the man who actually, as I say, his first shots, these two shots which killed the royal couple almost immediately, his two shots really were the opening shots of the whole Great War. And it was very important that this couple should die, particularly from the point of view of this man. His name is Dragutin Dmitrievich, and he was the commander of the Serbian military intelligence. He was also the ruler, or rather I should say the commander of the group which called itself the Black Hand, a secret society. Here's its device here. And its motto, unity or death. And his goal was to create a South Slavic state under the control of the Serbs. So he was very much a Serbian nationalist. So in that sense, his goal was not quite the same as the young men who actually carried out the murder. So he really wanted Serbia to be on top. He had been involved in an assassination already in 1903. They had murdered, together with the Serbian officer corps, they had murdered the Serbian royal family in a horrendous deed which had shocked the whole of Europe. Butchered them to death in the royal palace, threw their bodies naked over the balcony. Everybody was totally shocked, except for the Russian ambassador, Nicholas Hardwig, because Nicholas Hardwig was involved with the whole thing, and he, as it were, oversaw it, because Nicholas Hardwig saw Serbia as an instrument of Russia's goals in the Balkans. So he was a pan-Slavist and a Russianist. He wanted Russia to lead the Slavs. And at every step of the game, he was determined to use Serbia to destroy Austria-Hungary so that Russia could achieve its aims of becoming the leader of the Slavic peoples. Remember, this is a time 100 years ago of tremendous nationalism, such as we don't have now. We only have minor nationalism in Europe today compared to 100 years ago. So he was one of those who was very much involved in the South Slavic nationalist movement in the Balkans. But also, there was this guy, James D. Bourchier, the Times Balkan correspondent. And Mr. Bourchier and Mr. Hartwig were both involved in putting together the Balkan League to bring together the little Balkan countries which would fight against Turkey in 1912-1913. That was the conflict which led on to the Great War in 1914. So it's interesting to see an Englishman involved in all of this. You know, the Iranians have a saying. They say, if you want to find out about the problems in the world, lift up a stone and you'll find an Englishman. And here we have a Times correspondent. In those days, Times correspondents were really important people. Remember, the Times was the leading media organ for the educated classes. And Times correspondents in those days were regarded as extremely knowledgeable, well-read, well-travelled, and so on. So you would have your gentlemen in your gentlemen's club sipping their whiskies, reading their Times newspaper about the foreign news, what's going on in the continent, and they would really cite or quote from these Times correspondents. They had tremendous impact on the public, the educated public of those days. And then behind Mr. Hartwig, who, as I say, was seeking to use the Serbs to bring about Russia's goals, we have the Russian Foreign Secretary, Sazonov, assisted by the Minister of War, Sukhomlinov, and the Chief of the General Staff, Yanushkevich. And it would be these three men in June, July 1914 who would lead Russia into war and would bring about the first mobilization of the great powers. And that really started the ball rolling. Because when Russia allied itself with France in 1892, and the generals who did that deal, the Russian general and the French general, they were quite clear with each other that mobilization meant war. You didn't have to wait for a declaration. As soon as a nation mobilized, that was the first act of war. And for all the great powers, this was the case. That's how their generals and their governments saw it. It wasn't so much declaration of war which was important by this time. The technology had taken things to the point where you had to move fast. You had to mobilize your forces quickly. And to gain an edge, even over a few days or a few hours, was vital. So mobilization, once you committed to mobilization, that was it. You couldn't go back. So these three men were the ones who, as I say, started Russia's mobilization in July 1914. And they were also, these Russians, were backed, so to speak. Now we go a little bit further down the rabbit hole, as it were, by another three, or rather two. Here's Sazonov again. And his hands were being held in this whole process which led to the First World War by the French ambassador, Maurice Paléologue, and the British ambassador, Sir George Buchanan. Because remember, at that time, France was already allied to Russia, and so that's a formal alliance, and Britain had an informal entente, as we call it. Not a formal alliance with all the obligations thereof, but an entente, an agreement, basically to cooperate with the Russians. So it was these two, in the crisis of June, July, early August 1914, who kind of kept Sazonov on track and took him up to the edge. Yes, you can do it. Yes, you can go there. They did nothing, and this is important, they did nothing, neither of these two men, to restrain the Russians for their first movement of mobilization. So let's step back a minute, from 1914 to today. Whoops. This particular rogues gallery, some of you may have seen them in action in recent months on TV or on the radio, particularly Paxman and Portillo. They've done documentaries. And then, of course, politicians, Michael Gove and Boris Johnson, have made statements in the press about the First World War as we approach the anniversary. And you probably know that the government committed to spend 50 million on celebrating the centenary. And then here we have Sir Max Hastings, military historian, who wrote the book Catastrophe, which is the big bestseller on this subject, or supposed to be, last year in our one remaining nationwide bookshop, Waterstones. It was all up there on the top shelf, Catastrophe by Max Hastings. Well, what were these gentlemen saying? Well, you can imagine what they were saying. Germany started it, Germany was to blame, Germany wanted to dominate Europe and the world, Germany threatened Britain, Germany broke international law. In other words, they repeated and are repeating all the arguments which were made on the Allied side in 1914 and again in 1919 when the war finished at the Treaty of Versailles. Germany is to blame. That was important because we wanted to get lots of money from the Germans to pay reparations, so to justify these enormous sums we had to make them accept the blame. And it's not often mentioned, certainly not by the Rogues Gallery I showed you before, that the British blockade of Germany did not cease with the armistice. The blockade by the Navy, the economic warfare, continued from November 11th, 1918 until the 28th of June 1919. So German civilians, Austro-Hungarian civilians were continuing to die of starvation through that whole period. It was only when the Peace of Versailles was signed that that was stopped. So they are repeating, in effect, the arguments of the Allies. It was all their fault. Britain was in the right, Blackadder and the war poets were wrong, meaning it wasn't a nonsensical, absurd struggle. On the contrary, it was a noble struggle. Britain was right to fight, it was not a waste of life, and the British generals were not donkeys leading lions. That was an attitude to the war which really came through very strongly in the 60s, if those of you were old enough to remember that. Oh, What a Lovely War, that famous play and musical and film. Oh, there's Boris again. Yes. So, if we just pop back to 1914, the Times, 2 days after Britain declared war, the Times said, in an editorial, quote, "The British people are drawing their collective sword in the good old cause. Once again, in the words which King William inscribed upon his standard, they will maintain the liberties of Europe. It is the cause for which Wellington fought at the Peninsula and Nelson at Trafalgar, the cause which saw its crowning triumph on the field of Waterloo. It is the cause in which Oliver's Ironsides and their French comrades beat the finest infantry of Spain, and for which Drake and Howard of Effingham routed the Armada, the cause of the weak against the strong, of the small peoples against their overweening neighbours, of law against brute force, of the Commonwealth of Europe." The Commonwealth of Europe. "Against the domination of the sword." So that's how the Times saw the war 2 days after we entered it, to rally the troops, rally the nation, so to speak. And of course it's basically the image of St. George protecting the Belgian princess against the German dragon. And this mythology, if you will, this mythos, has proved, sadly, all too effective with us English, us Scots, us Irish, us Welsh, but possibly particularly the English, because after all, the cross of St. George is the English flag. This story that we go to defend the poor little weak guys against the big bad bullies, it strikes a note somewhere in many hearts, even today. And you'll notice that in recent years it's still being used by our politicians to justify outrageous incursions, attacks against foreign countries of all kinds.